Okie dokie. Well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with SolarPVTraining.com. And if you're new to this format, what I the way we do this is we kind of break it down into three sections. First, I'm going to try and recap what's been happening in the world of solar for the last week or so. Then we'll look at events, webinars, things of that nature that are coming up. And then we'll go into a deep dive on a topic that's of interest within the solar industry. This week, we're looking at some of the changes that are happening in net metering legislation and the like, and what the reaction to those will be and has been. So, net metering is a very important part of putting solar onto your home. So, I think you'll find that interesting. And again, part of the format of this is we do have quite a number of people online with us. Hopefully, we open up for questions and inquiries, but it just becomes a conversation for those of us who are geeking out about the world of solar or just want to be informed and make sure we don't miss something that may be important happening. So let me go ahead and jump into that. So this is for the week of April 13th, 2025. Four Republican U.S. senators have added their name to those 21 Republican congressional representatives who signed a letter earlier in support of the renewable energy provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. The latest letter was signed by Senators Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Tom Tillis from Florida, John Curtis from Utah, and Jerry Moran from Kansas, and they expressed their support of the provisions within the IRA. The House committees will soon begin a budget reconciliation project with the Senate, so this support comes at a good time. One of the reasons for this is of the total investments made under the IRA, at least 57% of them went to districts currently held by Republican House members. That amounts to about $171 billion. Republican districts have also received nearly 3/4 of the private investment that's underwritten by the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And by region, the Midwest saw a lot more funding for these energy projects than any other region in the country, 3 times that was received by the East Coast. Over 209,000 jobs were created in private energy projects, subsidized by the $163 billion of IRA funding that has been spent. At least 2/3 of these announced jobs were in politically red districts. The median number of jobs announced within Republican districts is about 600, which is exactly double that of in Democratic districts at about 300. PJM Interconnection has announced that they're going to be working with Google to use artificial intelligence to potentially revamp and speed up the interconnection approval process. They announced this last Thursday. Tapestry, which is part of Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, will work with PJM on a multi-year project to integrate dozens of databases and tools that the grid operator currently uses to study interconnection requests and create a unified model within PJM's network. Now, this unified model is supposed to allow project developers, grid planners, and operators to make interconnection decisions much more quickly. Google pointed out that it took 2 years for MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator, to approve through manual processes a large interconnection request, interconnecting to the grid. They use this application, which is AI driven, to reproduce that study, and they were able to reproduce that 2 years of activity in 10 days and arrived at similar results as that manual process. The time it takes to interconnect a project to the grid can vary significantly, but generally it's a process that today takes between 4 and 5 years. A lot of that time is spent in the queue, which is ever growing, even before it's looked at. other factors like project size, location, and the utility that's considering it can also impact the amount of time it takes for that interconnection request. Now, based on the percentage of electricity that the grid in the grid that comes from renewables, 7 of the top 10 states in the U.S. are actually Republican or red politically dominated states, according to the EIA, which is the U.S. Energy Information Administration. In 2023, solar and wind met 22% of blue states' demand for electricity and about 17% for red states. However, the rapid adoption of renewable energy in traditionally red states such as Texas or my home of Ohio are closing that gap. Clean energy passed a major milestone last year. For the first time, wind and solar produced more electricity in the U.S. than coal. Recent analysis shows that in 2024, wind and solar met 17% of the total U.S. demand, while coal supplied only about 15%. Now, coal peaked as a source for electricity in 1990 when it supplied over half of all of the electricity nationwide. Overall, U.S. renewable power output has risen sharply since 2000, propelled by a mix of falling costs and supportive political policies. Well, federal incentives have kind of been ebbed and flowed, I guess is a nice word of saying it, during that period. State level investment has been a lot more steady. Market trends have also accelerated this shift. Over the past decade, the costs of deploying wind and solar have fallen by 70 to 90%. Wind and solar now are significantly less expensive to deploy than coal, gas, or oil. And a 2023 study by Duke Energy found that it spends twice as much money running existing coal power plants as compared with the cost of replacing them with brand new solar arrays. And as solar energy expands across agricultural land, there are a lot of dual use solar practices that are emerging. A dual use solar approach known as cattle voltaics, this is a term new to me, integrates cattle grazing and solar panels that provide benefits to farmers as well as energy producers as well. A fact sheet recently released by the Center for Rural Affairs explores the economic and environmental advantage of cattle voltaics and provides insights into the best practices for this. Shade, of course, is one advantage for people raising cattle and having solar arrays. Reducing the heat stress of cattle can increase the weight gain for beef cattle. It increases milk production for dairy cattle. This, according to the Center for Rural Affairs. Most farmers already use some sort of shading structure out there, and now they can get a dual use out of that by not only shading the animals, but producing energy as well. Now, also beyond the direct benefit to the cattle, the fact sheet contends that grazing under solar panels also improves soil health. It improves soil stability, and actually you get a better return on your pastures because grass growing in a semi-shaded environment is better than or more productive than out in full sunshine. Farms can also benefit from lease payments from these solar developers while continuing to use the land for agricultural purposes. Of course, that's known as agrivoltaics. And local community also receives tax dollars from these projects. You can get a copy of this if you're so inclined, called Cattle Voltaics Maximizing Land Use with Solar Cattle Grazing at cfra.org/publications. And that's the news that I came up with this week. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Anything that came across your desk as we move forward?
I would suggest or at least comment, and I'd like to hear what the other folks think as well. The Inflation Reduction Act that was the impetus for a lot of the growth over the past few years. A good deal of that went directly to the states for the states to inaugurate their own programs and start those programs for distribution of grants and such. And the reason we see a lot of the red states or red districts taking advantage of that is because it was low hanging fruit for them,
Mhm.
which is a wonderful thing. Illinois, for example, really did embrace community solar, unlike a lot of states. They took it on. So did Georgia, and I know that because some of the consulting I've done has been in both of those states recently. Um, so it's good to see that these Republican senators are beginning to realize what they have, and they don't want to lose it. In my own district in Savannah, Georgia, the representative Buddy Carter touts all of these things as having been contributory, and yet he didn't vote for either one of these programs,
Mhm.
and yet he certainly does take credit for it. So it's a good thing, and your displays there, I think, are accurate, but we can't forget the fact that so many of those red districts were lagging so far behind, and this gave them a chance to catch up, which is a real positive step.
Yep. Yeah, one of the ways that the IRA also helped rural America, at least that I'm involved with, is it did provide additional funding through the REAP program with the USDA, and that goes directly to rural businesses and primarily agricultural businesses. So I think any of us that have the opportunity to speak with our legislatures, especially if you're in a district like mine that is exceedingly conservative and exceedingly Republican in nature. I have set up an appointment with my local congressman, really just to reinforce to him that he no longer lives in a coal mining district. He lives in a renewable energy district, and he has to change his mindset around that. It's a seismic shift for him, clearly. But if you can just simply, in a non-confrontational way, point out, listen, 5,000 people work in your district in renewable energy and 50 work in coal, who are you supporting? And we'll see. It's slowly, slowly, slowly. To my way of thinking, solar should be, a mega movement thing, made in America, domestically produced, we're all out there. It should be. It should be. I don't know why they've made it a political thing. I don't view it as a political thing. But any other comments before we jump forward?
Sounds like you're expecting them to have some kind of reasonable approach to this thing, which is not what I notice.
Yeah, yeah, we can only hope. We can only hope. So I guess we either despair or we keep on trying. So yeah. All right, well, let's get into what are some of the events that are coming up here. Oh, somebody just raised a thing that Microsoft announced. Oh, they were a data center they're getting rid of in Licking County, Ohio. All right, so the upcoming webinars, April 16th or April 15th, today. Oh, happy tax day. Yes. Illinois shines, prevailing wage. This is another thing that I think we lose sight of. One of the things that the IRA, and I lose track of which one is which, but anyway, the provisions that were put in place is if you want to take advantage of all of the tax savings through the investment tax credits for these large programs, you have to pay prevailing wage. And prevailing wage is, at least to the folks I deal with here in Ohio, somewhere in the $40 an hour range for these guys to start installing solar. Well, that's significant. That's an annualized salary of around 80,000 bucks. So that's all good. So webinar today, this afternoon at 2 on Illinois' prevailing wage requirements. Then we have on the 16th, de-risking energy storage at 1 p.m. through Wood Mackenzie. IREC is doing a session on the 16th regarding solar apprenticeship programs. That's going to be at 2 p.m. Then there's a webinar on the 17th at 2 p.m. about unlocking future storage. This is probably a product announcement type, promotions. So, but those are often very helpful. Then we have April 24th at 11 a.m. AI and the tech industry. Of course, AI being something on everybody's focused on and nobody knows what they're talking about for the most part, including myself. April 29th, Tuesday at noon, safeguarding solar investments. We'll see what that's about. And April 30th at 2 p.m., domestic supply chain issue. So these are all, and again, I'll just mention these times are Eastern time. You can make the adjustments accordingly. And if you need access to it, hopefully you're catching who's putting it on. Just do a Google search on it rather than me provide. April 30th, beyond Trump's first 100 days. Okay. And May 1st, we've got how to make a successful grant application. There still are a lot of grants out there, and if you want to make a successful one, that's a workshop from CEA. Solar Power World is again AI and solar. That's May 15th. And then Clean Power. This is a face-to-face conference in Phoenix, Arizona on the 19th through the 22nd. June 3rd, a session about residential solar sales at noon. And then our shameless plug, which is solarpvtraining.com, where we have our upcoming classes as well as our online classes. So that's what came across my desk. Anybody have anything they want to add to that? Just to make you, it feels like there are a lot more webinars all of a sudden popping up. They seem to come in waves, at least the ones I'm made aware of. All right, so then when we get into our deep dive here a little bit, it occurred to me, I was reading through some of the materials, and one of the areas that is of interest, certainly to those of us who own solar arrays, those of us who are thinking about it, whether it's a business or residential, is just what kind of compensation you're going to receive as you send product back or send energy back to the grid and then import energy from the grid. I'll point out too that all of these sessions are approved for 30 minutes or half an hour of continuing education through the ETA, the Electronic Technicians Association's solar certification. The certifications that are out there in this industry, there are really primarily two of them that are recognized by authorities having jurisdiction here in the US. That's ETA being one, which has the solar certification level 1 and level 2. And then there is NABCEP. And NABCEP has what they call their certificate programs, which are the associate programs, not really a true certification, but a certificate. And then they do have their certifications, installer, designer, and there's other ones. It gets a wee bit confusing, but those are the two you can look at. So what are we talking about here? I always like this line, which has been attributed to Gandhi, but then as I was looking, the AP says, nope, he's not the one who said it first, but nobody said anything first. But it's that first they ignore you, then they ridicule you or they laugh at you, then they attack you or fight you, and then you win. And that's kind of the way that we've been dealing here in the solar world. Way back when many of us started in this environment, started getting interested in solar, it was such an inconsequential industry that it was widely ignored. The utilities could care less. For example, when I installed my solar array, turns out I was like the third solar array that the utility had ever had installed in their jurisdiction. So when I called them up and saying, what do we need to do? How do we do this? To them, it was a novelty. It was interesting. They put me in touch with Zach, who was the only guy who cared about solar. And so then at some point, it becomes common enough, that you can ridicule it. You're nothing but a bunch of tree hugging, Prius driving, whatever. And so they make fun of it. Then, and this is the area we're in at the moment, then it's an existential threat to their business model. So they attack. And then you win. It is inevitable that renewable energy will win this battle. I mean, it can be no other way due to simple economics. I don't care if you love beautiful, clean coal. It's not coming back. It costs 3 times as much money as the alternatives. So why would you do it? I mean, people want electricity. They don't care whether it's coal or gas or solar or wind. Most people just don't care. They just want electricity and they want it as cheaply as possible. Well, guess what? Solar meets that bill. Wind meets that bill, but it's a harder reach. So ultimately, solar wins until something better comes along, and we don't know what that something better is. Technology marches forward. Who knows? But for right now, solar is half the cost, really, of all of the alternatives. So it will win. Public policy, federal policy, state policy, all of that, it can push things forward a little bit. It can retard them a little bit. But the growth pattern is up and to the right. It will continue to be. And nothing they're going to do about it. It can be annoying, but we're marching there. It's going to get there. So anyway, so we're in The Empire Strikes Back. This is like episode, what is that, 5 or whatever? It's like we had a wonderful ceremony. We all patted each other on the back, and now all of a sudden the big meanies are coming back and saying we're gonna beat you to a pulp. And okay, they will for a while. Okay, so what is net metering? What am I talking about here? Well, in its most simplistic terms, in the middle of the day when the sun is shining and you're not using as much electricity as you're generating, it gets pushed back onto the grid. Think of the grid as an unlimited battery, right? It's just going onto the grid and you get credit for it. Like the odometer of a car, the meter runs forward, the meter runs backwards, and all you do is pay the net amount. That was the conceptual beginnings of this. So push power back onto the grid during the day, use it at night, size your system so that hopefully by the end of the year, you're paying zero. That's the dream. Why did the utilities allow this? For the most part, at least here in the US, they were mandated by law. Back during the time when nobody cared. When it was a bipartisan issue, states passed these laws that said, okay, Mr. Public Utility, if you want to, you've got to accept this power back from these folks. And so they do. They have to. Now, it was never a big concern when people with solar were 1/100% of their customer base. But now you're starting to get into this is a significant situation. And, to be fair to the utilities, they're in the business of selling power, right? They're there to sell power. Well, why on earth would they want to buy power at full retail, which is basically what we're asking them to do? We're saying, okay, when I have extra power, I want you to buy it back at full retail and then sell it back to me when I need it. That's fine to do in little tiny bits, but when it becomes a significant portion, it's not exactly. And they will come back and say, listen, there's infrastructure costs associated with us taking this power and redelivering it back to it. We need to be compensated for that. And, good argument, fair argument. Now the question is, how much is that compensation and what is fair? That's where we get. So that's net metering at its most basic. I don't need to zoom in on that. But like every basic situation, everything, it gets complicated. It can get complicated. So let's look at the single owner, right? What we think about as net metering, you got a solar array on a property during the day, you send it to the grid. At night, you get it back to the grid, and there's 1 meter. Okay, what about right below that, say a farm? And we've got multiple meters. We've got a dairy barn, and we've got our house, and we've got a grain dryer. And each one of them has its own meter, but maybe the barn is the best place to put a solar array. So I want to put my solar array on the barn, but I want to apply its production to all three of those meters. Well, that's certainly possible. The only thing is, I need the utility to agree. And these utilities are not always the most agreeable folk, you know? So you have to say, can we do aggregation? Can I produce it at one location and aggregate it over multiple meters? And I have seen situations where the utility says, yeah, as long as they're within X distance, as long as they're within 500 yards of each other or whatever. Well, that's arbitrary, because if you look just below that, what about multi-site aggregation? Why does it have to be within 500 yards of each other? Why couldn't I have one building on one side of town, another building 50 miles away, another building somewhere else, and I put one big solar array and allocate it to all of them? As long as they're within the same operating area for the utility, it's simple accounting. I'm just generating power, putting it onto the grid in one location, and then I want to allocate that production over multiple bills. That's all it is. Once again, got to have the cooperation of the utility, and they would make the argument, listen, we're not here to buy power from you at retail. You know, that's not our business model. So, yeah, and somebody's pointing out Jersey has laws. So where do these things happen? Well, in places that the state steps in. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get to community solar. But then you've got other issues like, like an apartment building or a condo or something like that, where you have multiple owners in a single building. So once again, we have one big solar array up on the roof, and we want to allocate its production to multiple tenants. You know, can we do that? It's still net metering, but now it's one array, multiple meters again, but it's all on the same building. Or do you have to, and we run into this a lot, create, it looks like one array, but it's multiple arrays, and they're all feeding into the different meters. And it adds cost, it adds complexity to the system. So that's multi-tenant. And then the ultimate is community solar. You know, if we're going to put a big solar array out there, it doesn't have to be owned by the same person. You know, we, under the multi-site aggregation, we said, what if I have 6 buildings? I want to put up a big solar array and allocate it to my 6 buildings. Well, why do I have to be the owner? Couldn't I put a big solar array up and aggregate its production to as many different owners as I wish? Well, that ultimately is community solar, where we take a big array and we allocate that to individual bills based on their percentage of ownership. So when we say net metering, you know, conceptually you can think one house, one array, back and forth. That's easy, but it gets more complicated than that. So I just wanted to point that out. I know I'm seeing comments flying up, but anybody have a comment they want to say out loud at this stage here? Give you that opportunity. Don't be shy. All right, so where are these net metering laws? Who has these laws? That many of them got on the books before anybody really cared. So the ones in sort of a darkish bluish, gray blue, those states, and it says 34 states, basically have mandatory rules for their publicly owned utilities, or investor-owned utilities, I should say. They usually call those IOUs, investor-owned utilities. And I'm most familiar with Ohio, but I'm assuming that most states are very similar in that regard. The investor-owned utilities within our state are required to do net metering. Now, the legislation did not say how much they have to pay you for the net metering. It just said you're required to do net metering. The co-ops, the electrical co-ops, and the municipally held electric companies, or munis, are exempt from that legislation. Those are considered user-owned systems, so they do not require net metering, although most of them will participate in some sort of net metering program. Some are better than others. So then we see some that are in transition. Well, Illinois was mentioned, Arkansas is mentioned there. Some of them where statewide distribution is there. It says generation compensation rules other than net metering. So something by a different name, perhaps. They often, I forget the term for it. It's not net metering. It's what, net billing, something like that. Anyway, and we'll get into the difference there. And then of course a few states, in particular Texas and Idaho, there show up with no mandatory, but some utilities do it, some don't. And Tennessee sitting there all by its lonesome. It's like, we don't need no stinking net metering, we're Tennessee. So and of course, Tennessee, to be fair, it's mostly hydro, right? I mean, Tennessee Valley Authority. So they actually have legacy, fairly intensively renewable and relatively inexpensive. All right, so I was just saying that we're in episode 4, The Empire Strikes Back, or episode 5, whichever one it is. So what's happening? What states are looking at changing net metering laws? It's like everybody, except for Tennessee that doesn't have them, and Nebraska and Montana, right? And some of these are doing a lot of changes. I mean, the darker reddish is 10 or more legislative actions in 2024 focused on net metering. So California, Arizona, Oregon, Virginia, Maine, all of these are looking at doing net metering laws. And spoiler alert, most of them are not trying to make it better. Most of them are trying to eliminate some of the provisions that have been enjoyed in the past under net metering. So what are these when you break all of those actions down? In fact, 269 different actions statewide on net metering. And most of them, well, not most, but the largest, the plurality, is compensation policies, right? That's at the top of the list, 38% of them. And what do we mean by compensation? Well, for the most part, in the early days of net metering, you got a 1-for-1 payback. If I sent power back to the grid, I got paid retail for it. Well, now what the utilities are saying is, we'll still pay you for it, but we want to pay you wholesale, and then we're going to charge you retail. And we'll get further in depth on some of these. Then we start getting into minimum bills. Okay, so you're out there. Remember the goal of all of this, what we get sold when somebody comes and tries to sell us a solar array. We're going to get it so you don't have an electric bill. That's the goal. So the utilities are going, wait a second, son, we want to charge you something, and we don't want you to be able to bypass that. We want a fixed fee coming to us for you hooking up to the utility. And some of those fixed fees are reasonable and some of them are not. Then there's community solar legislation, whether you have it, you don't have it. So that's one area where I think we're starting to see a pushback, perhaps in what many of us would think is the right direction, where community solar gets more accessible. I personally feel like community solar is more digestible to the utilities and to the big boys because it follows the same logic of utilities. A big centralized owner and somebody distributing it out to the dummy terminals, which were us, basically. We're the dummy terminals. So that follows that model closer than a distributed system. So I think there's perhaps people are looking at that as a way to make some money, which always seems to be behind it. So I don't want to dwell too long on that, but just to give you a sense of, and this is the term I was getting towards, net metering versus net billing. And this is one of those terms to me that is somebody in marketing came up with because um, it's you're basically trying to say this in a nice way, but you are coming off less well in this system. So under an energy net metering process, that's the one for one, right? I send money, I send energy to the grid, and the numbers I'm using here are average costs for California. So I just picked one. They're kind of the most extreme. So on average, it costs about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity in the state of California. If I was net metering, I would send power back. I'd get compensated effectively 30 cents for every kilowatt hour I sent back. Under net metering 3.0 or NEM 3.0, which went into effect, this is what it changed to. I buy it at 30 cents, I sell it back at 8 cents on average. So this caused quite a lot of uproar in the state of California. But this is kind of the model that we're moving to. Most of those legislations that were out there making adjustments to net metering, this is what they're going for. And oftentimes they're only paying you wholesale on the generation portion of your bill. Your electric bills are morphing into something that are essentially incomprehensible. That seemed to be what they did with telephone bills, and now they're doing it with the electric bills. Because it used to be you got an electric bill and it said, okay, I used 800 kilowatt hours this month. The cost was 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and here was my bill. Well, now you're getting excess charges, so non-bypassable fixed fees. Then you get generation charges. What is the cost of generating that power? What is the cost of transportation or transmission, I should say, which takes it from the generating facility to the distribution network, which is usually the substations that are owned by the utility. And then you get distribution charges. And then you get charges for the Spanish-American War, and you get charges for whatever else they decide to throw on there as charges. They often have renewable energy charges, which I love. It makes people, hate renewable energy. But I think those typically represent if a state has a renewable portfolio standard and they didn't meet it, they pass along some of the costs of not meeting those charges. So they call them renewable energy charges, like it's your fault. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with here. Basically, we sell wholesale, we pay retail. So what's the response? When you're faced with that response, well, of course, California, they were faced with the response immediately when that was put into effect, where it was 40% of all solar installers lost their job, like right away. Huge decline in demand. If you see a 75% reduction in compensation for sending power back to the grid, demand falls. But battery sales, self-consumption. If I'm only getting paid 8 cents and I'm paying 30 cents, why would I send that power back to the grid? Why wouldn't I just keep it and use it? Well, if I'm going to keep it and use it, I need to have some way to store it. In the past, I've used the grid as an unlimited battery. I don't have that option anymore. So now I need an actual battery. So this is when you take power that you're generating in the middle of the afternoon, and typically it gets consumed in the evening, and then of course overnight if you have batteries large enough. The study I saw said adding a 6 kilowatt hour battery for the normal household can increase self-consumption from 20 to 30% up to around 70%. So right there, you're taking 40% that you would have been paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour, and your effective cost is going to be closer to 8 cents, what you would have been getting in exchange for sending it back to the grid. So, batteries. And that's one of the reasons why as many as 50% of all of the installations that are going out there today incorporate some sort of battery. And the holy grail of this movement, of this moving towards storage, is to be able to then use your electric vehicle as the battery storage mechanism. So that's what we're moving towards. That's where we're going to be. Let me give you guys just an option here to jump in, have a point of view.
There's one more factor in some of the utilities trying to take control. Georgia, for example, has a maximum of 10 kW that can be applied to a single family residence, but that's the max. But you're also limited to only 110% of your most recent year of energy bills. So you can fudge that a little bit if you could convince the local utility that you want to go from gas to all electric, and what was your therms used in terms of kilowatts, that sort of thing. But what they're really saying is we're going to limit you to what you can produce. And the argument that they make is we don't want these little utilities everywhere because it's going to upset our grid. Well, it's the wrong argument completely. It's an enhancement of the grid, not detrimental to it. But there you go. That's Georgia.
Yep. Al, you have a comment?
Yes. Sorry. A couple things. One is what I've learned over the last 6 years of having my own solar array is that clearly, they pay me 3 cents wholesale and I pay them 15, 16 cents retail. So the bottom line is you really don't want to send any power out to the grid if you can avoid it. So I bought a plug-in electric car like you have, and I got a heat pump that I use on the shoulder seasons. So the idea is to get my self-consumption as high as possible and what I send to the grid as low as possible. And that seems to be working pretty well. It's fairly intentional. It's a fair amount of work to do that. But the other question I had for you was, like many people, I have a battery. It's about a 10 kilowatt battery. And but I also have a critical loads panel, because primarily what I use the battery for is, backup in case of a power outage. So, but it's kind of hard to divert power, using a critical loads panel. Any suggestions?
Yeah, well, most of the systems now, the newer ones, and yours, it sounds like you were one of the more early adopters, so you may be at a slight disadvantage, but most of the battery backup systems today are programmable, where you can simply go in and flick a toggle and say, move to self-consumption mode as opposed to grid backup mode. And then it's going to monitor, and you can set how deep a depth of discharge I want to go. So some of that activity will be done automatically, and it will not kick you to your diverted load panel as long as the grid signal is there. That only switches that, when the grid is lost. So you can still self-consume, on critical loads as well as non-critical loads.
Now, is that done through the battery itself or through the inverter?
I suspect it's probably not done through the battery. It's probably either done through the inverter or the switch, the thing that's controlling it. Like with the Enphase system, there is an intelligent switch that everything connects into. With a lot of those other systems, that is being handled within the inverter itself. Okay. So my guess is it's probably in the inverter or the smart switch, depending on how they're configured. In Enphase, for example, they have where you can set it for automatic backup, like grid backup. So it's full all the time unless the grid goes out. Now I just use it, and I use it for my critical loads. That's kind of how we mostly think about battery backup. Then there's a self-consumption mode where it says, I want to use as much of this as possible, and you set a depth of discharge. So it's going to anticipate, based on behaviors, what that's going to be. It also has now in beta version an AI version of that where it's going to make its decision based on weather reports,
Yeah.
based on past behaviors, all of those kind of things. Who knows what's going to happen? AI, to my experience with AI is it's in its stupid phase right now. It's so who knows what it's going to do, but it'll eventually get refined. It's like a teenager. Eventually, it grows up and it gets out of its stupid phase into its, I don't know, despair phase or whatever you do in your 20s. Okay, so then there's also the focused on time of use pricing. So there's the save money option. So it's not so much about self-consumption. It's use the grid when it's cheap, use your battery when the grid is expensive. So when you have time of day pricing, it goes into that mode. So and probably AI does a little bit of both. So these things are getting more complicated. Then you start having systems that integrate your EV. So now your EV becomes a load dump, So if you say, okay, I want to maximize self-consumption, well, charge your electric vehicle only when I have excess power from my array. Don't charge it from the grid. So that's kind of what they're doing in their early stages of that is if I've got excess power, don't send it back to the grid, use it to charge my EV. So normally your EV just gets charged when you plug it in, whether it's from your grid or whether it's from your array. This will allow you not to use the grid to charge your EV. That may cause you some problems, especially if it's a day where, it's not being charged and you really wanted it to be charged. So those are some of the issues that are out there. Now, in response about the 110% in sizing the grid, this has come up in some discussions I've had with folks recently because they keep coming to me and say, have you heard of anybody? Because here in Ohio, we're limited to 120% of our consumption. So I'm not allowed to build a solar array that generates more than 120% of what I consume. And they ask me, have you heard of anybody who's gotten dinged on that, where the electricity police come out and say, hey, you produce too much power? And the answer there is I have not. It may be only enforceable when you're building the system, because you've got to get approval from the utility in order to, get permission to operate and all of that. And they're going to look at your past bills and you're going to have to go through those hoops. But once the thing's installed, are they really monitoring it? Are they really going to police it? They have the option, obviously, but I don't know if they've got the capacity, to really to do that. So I don't know. Maybe we're in the first you ignore them stage. Not enough people are over generating. If it becomes an option, perhaps then we get into the, then they attack. But, seems to me, we always joke about that. If you're overproducing, just start running electric cords to all your neighbors, in December and say, hey guys, Christmas is on me, baby. It's
Jay,
like use up power, So,
Jay,
yeah.
I have an 8K system at my house, right? First, it was supposed to be a 3K, then it turned into an 8K.
Mm-hmm.
I have $700 worth of credit. And I'm with Dominion, East Ohio Gas, or is that right? But nobody's ever said anything about me because over the winter time, I would use 2 electric heaters in my living room, which is like a 12 by 24 room. And that was comfortable enough for me so that I didn't have to kick the gas on unless it was really cold.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me if you've got $700 in credit, that would be enough to, if they're going to go after somebody, you get to be first on the list because yeah, yeah. I now know why your video's not turned on because you're in it, and your name is probably a witness protection name or something. So
Right.
okay, all right. Well, let me jump forward here. So we're seeing how that is. And as you would imagine, we've started to see the growth of storage just go through the roof. And it continues to grow, and it will continue to grow because it's a logical response, especially as battery prices come down. If you're not going to pay me a reasonable price for my product, well, then I'm not going to sell it to you. I really think another option that's going to emerge from this gets into virtual utilities. I've used that example in the past where Apple decides they want to become a utility. They buy access to the grid, and then they set up the iPower network where if I want to sell my excess power back, my utility tells me they're only going to pay me 3 cents or 8 cents. The iPower network will pay me 11 cents or whatever. Well, I'm going to join into the iPower network. And that network is a negotiated price between the consumer of the electricity and the producer of the electricity. And Apple is just the facilitator and renting space on the grid and taking a service fee. So they become the largest utility in the country, but they don't own the infrastructure. I could see that happening, and it's a good business model. And one of you on this call should go out and start that company because that would be great. Then the other issue that we're dealing with are fixed charges. Currently nationwide, the average fixed charge is $11 a month. These are non-bypassable charges. So the argument from the utility is, hey, we have costs associated with bringing you this power. We need to recoup some of them. Pay us for that. And they go in and they make this argument all the time. The thing that they don't admit is their fixed costs include every single stupid decision they've ever made. These guys are brilliant managers. You would be a brilliant manager if you were unable to have a loss. These are public utilities. If they make stupid decisions, they just go before the Public Utility Commission and say, hey, we're losing some money. We need a rate increase. We see that all of the time. So that's perhaps an argument against such a thing. You see some of the rate increases there. Somebody was just bringing up that the cost of their utility is $50 a month for access. The cost for me, and I'm connected to a co-op. If you don't have solar, it's $24. If you do have solar, it's $48. So they've actually made a differentiation there, saying if you're connected to the grid and you have solar, you're going to pay $48 a month as your access charge. If you don't have solar, you're only going to pay $24. So clearly they're trying to disincentivize solar. Here was an example of an article in PV Magazine where Arizona, the utility there, tried to get an $88 a month access fee for their customers. Well, a lot of people don't have an $88 a month electric bill. So now they're going to ask you to pay $88 just for the privilege of hooking up. So what is the response? What is the response if you have absurdly high electric access charges? Well, disconnect from the grid. For most of us and throughout most history, that wasn't really an option, but technology is getting us there and getting us there pretty quickly. I was trying to do some research. It looks like grid parity nationwide for solar plus battery will be hitting us right around 2027. So in 2 years, nationwide, already it's this in some places, but nationwide, it will be the same cost over the life of the system to hook up your own system, solar plus batteries, as it will be to pay the electric bill. This is essentially the same situation we were in 2012. at when solar connected to the grid hit grid parity. And from that moment on, we saw a dramatic exponential growth in solar because now economically it made sense for people to begin. Obviously, if you've got a 25-year payback on a system, it's not, unicorns and rainbows, but it's a start. And we're in that same beginning phase where I think you're going to start to see more and more people saying, you know what, the grid is providing me nothing but headaches. I'm going independent of the grid. And now I have the wherewithal and the opportunity to do so. And when I talk to utilities, I'll often tell them, you should not view yourself as being in the business of providing electricity to customers. You should be viewing yourself as in the electrical connectivity business, because I can provide electricity for myself. I cannot provide connectivity to other users. And I don't know where that's going to come into play, but at some point it will. Just like connectivity and communications comes into play, connectivity and electricity will come into play. So we're going to see the massive growth of standalone systems because utilities are just making it too difficult to do business with them. And so guess what? I'm going to opt out, and I can, especially when you start looking at electric vehicles as battery backup for your home. So that's something we should keep an eye out. And then, of course, we get into community solar. Community solar, due to a lot of factors like shading or low credit scores, some people just cannot finance these things. Property ownership, if you're renting, you're not really incentivized to put solar on your home. If you're the owner of a rental unit and the renter is paying the utilities, you're not incentivized to put solar on that vehicle. So some estimates put it as high as 77%. The better estimates, I think, is like a 50-50. But even at that, you just say half the houses in America are not suitable for solar. So what is their option if we're going to really transition to a renewable energy world? And that's community solar. Put a big array out there somewhere, and now I own a share of it, or at least a share of it, but I'm generating that. Well, what's the downside of that? You've basically got to have the utilities cooperate, and the utilities are not necessarily willing to cooperate. So what happens is in many states, they require the utilities to cooperate. States like New Jersey or states like Minnesota, community solar is a huge deal. I like the fact Minnesota basically said to the utilities, listen, if you want to do business in our state, you will abide by community solar. And as a result, community solar becomes the dominant form of renewable energy within the state. So it's all doable, but it requires legislation because these public utilities are not going to cooperate without being forced on that. And then you get in third-party ownership. And this is kind of a mixed blessing where, you look at some of these states, like the ones in green, these are states that allow solar leasing or power purchase agreements. The ones in red are the ones that prohibit it. And then the ones in gray, they say it's not available. I guess it's not expressly prohibited, but it's also not allowed by law. So what does this mean? It basically means I can go ahead and lease a system from someone without having to pay up front. Well, when it works, right? It's like I don't have the money to install it in myself, but an investor comes along and he says, all right, I'm going to front the installation cost. We're going to put this on your home, and you just have to agree that for the next 10 years, you're going to buy power through this system and at a lower rate than what your utility is currently charging you. Oh, good deal. Good deal. Except it's a bit like renting to own your television. These things are misused. A lot of shysters get involved. You're paying inordinate amounts. Oftentimes, people use lowest bid installers. The installers do a crappy job. The system never works. You're making payments on a system that doesn't work and you're not getting any energy from it. So it's perilous, but it's still, once again, when it works, it works. So it's a viable option. But what we need to do is do it better and police it and all of those other things. So third party option, like I said, a mixed blessing there. So and yeah, okay. I was trying to get my chain of thought here as to what this was all about. So what are the utilities saying, justifying all of these changes in net metering? They're basically saying that they're trying to pit people with solar against people without solar, right? They come in and they say these leeches who have put solar on their homes, they're costing you hard-working, beer-drinking Americans who don't have solar, they're costing you money. They're somehow, and so you get people fighting with each other, and then you get to earn your $17 million as CEO. So the reality is much different than the argument. All of the studies show that actually solar on the grid saves the utility money. It creates smoother demand curves. It reduces peak demand. Peak demand is when the electricity is at its highest for the utility. So it does save money for the utility. The impact of these changes that are going through at the moment, longer payback period for your solar array. If you're not getting compensated through net metering, it's going to take you longer. Job losses like we saw in California, slowing the energy growth, the energy transition to renewable, and also, of course, a boom in battery installations. I think I'll cut it off there. So I appreciate it. It looks like we're out of time. And I thank you for your attention. And I shall see you guys all next week. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.